Assistant is under instructions to refuse every request for every talk that I give. And so originally he said to Billy when he called, I couldn't do this. And he called me back. And I couldn't really say no. And I can't really say no to all of the chiropractors who are in this room. Because long before there was COVID, you guys were here, you knew you were already conspiracy theorists. You already knew what was going to happen. And you were at the front lines fighting it, and year after year after year. So as long as he asked me to come back here, I'm going to keep coming. I know you guys know more about the COVID vaccine, and I've done the deep dives, and I just want to talk about it for a second, just to give you a way to think about it. And then I'm going to talk about some of the other issues that, the freedom issues and some of this stuff. I take on some of the things that Lee was talking about just now. There's so many complexities with the COVID vaccine. This is kind of a simple way to think about it. Here's what we know. We don't know a lot because the company, Pfizer particularly, we almost know very, very little about the Moderna vaccine. We know more about Pfizer because Pfizer was the first one to get an approved vaccine. That vaccine, as you guys know, is not available in this country. It's the Comirnaty vaccine, and they couldn't let people have it because you can sue them if they're not under the EUA. Well, the EUA, the PrEP Act under the EUA, you can't sue them. But the only way that they can avoid a lawsuit once they're approved is if they get mandated for children. So if the CDC recommends them, which in this state is a mandate, then that vaccine has immunity for all ages, no matter who takes it. And that's why they needed to get approval for children, because it was the only way that they could get immunity from liability. And this is a product that they cannot allow. The death rate and the injury rate is so high for this product. There's a new study out there, kind of the standard studies that came from Thailand. The best study said that 1 out of every 2,700 boys who take this vaccine is going to get myocarditis. Half of those kids, historically, myocarditis kills 50% of the people who get it within 5 years, or if they don't get a heart transplant. So that's a very, very high rate of death. And we know that the Johns Hopkins looked at the risk to children from COVID in this country. Marty McCary, a Johns Hopkins professor, they could not find a single American child who died from COVID who was a healthy child. There are children who died, but they were people with profound comorbidities. The German data, which is very, very good and huge, huge group, is 3 children per million. So if COVID is killing 3 kids per million, and yet 1 in 2,700 kids who get the vaccine is getting myocarditis, half of those will be dead within 5 years, is clearly not a good product. Oh, and by the way, myocarditis is just one issue. There's strokes, there's all kinds of neurological. Pfizer's own data showed 1 out of every 1,100 girls between 12 and 16 who got the vaccine got permanent, debilitating neurological injuries. They only gave it to 1,100 kids in that study. One of them, Maddie DeGarry, is now in a wheelchair for life. She eats from a feeding tube. So that's a 1 in 1,100 rate. But and we don't know everything about the vaccine because Pfizer lied about Maddie DeGarry. When we went back and looked at her data, the way that Pfizer reported it was that she had a stomach ache. She's eating the feeding tube for the rest of her life. So we don't know what other lies they told. And that's why we're trying to get the raw data. But Pfizer made us go to court, and they told the judge they don't want to give it to us for 75 years. And not only that, but the FDA intervened in that lawsuit on the side of Pfizer, supporting that. Pfizer and the FDA and NIH all said we're going to be completely transparent. We know we're doing this very quickly, so we're going to be transparent about it. But what they meant, apparently, is they're going to be transparent in 75 years. Aaron Siri, brilliant lawyer, won the suit, and now they're handing over that data. So we're learning more and more every day. The major piece of data that we've gotten to date is that in order to get the approval for the Comirnaty vaccine, they had to hand in 6 months worth of preliminary data to FDA. And so we have that report to FDA, and it's their real summary of what the raw data is, according to them, supposed to say. Oh, and here's what it says. This is what Pfizer says. They gave the vaccine to 22,000 people. They gave a placebo to 22,000 people. In the vaccine group, there was over a 6-month period, and by the way, you remember Fauci saying we're going to do a 5-year study. We may give emergency use authorization 2 years or a year into that study, but we're going to continue to do the 5-year study because that's the only way you can see if there's long-term injuries from this product. And there's this famous 2008 video that a lot of you have seen of Fauci saying you have to have a 12-year study. Because if you can give the vaccine and it works, and you give it to 500 people, then you give it to 1,000 people, and you give it to the whole population, and 12 years later, his quote, all hell breaks loose. Because a lot of these vaccines, like every other medical product, has side effects with long incubation periods, long diagnostic horizons that you will not see for 12 years. So they promised us on the vaccine they're going to do a 5-year study. But what did they do after 2 months? They ended the study. They unblinded it. They gave the vaccine to the placebo group. So all of the long-term injuries will stay invisible forever because we do not have a placebo. We only had a placebo group for two months. Now, here's what they did. After 6 months, they looked at the placebo group and compared it to the vaccine group. And remember, the placebo group started getting the vaccine after 2 months, so there's not going to be that big a difference. And here's what they found. In the vaccine group, in that 6-month period of the 22,000 people, 1 person died from COVID. In the placebo group, during that period of 22,000 people, 2 people died from COVID. So that allowed the company and our government to tell the American people this vaccine is 100% effective because 2 is 100% of 1. Now, most people, when they hear it's 100% effective, are saying, oh, if I get it, I 100% won't die from COVID. That's not what it means. What it means is they have to give 22,000 vaccines to save 1 life from COVID. Now, if you're going to give 22,000 vaccines to save 1 life from COVID, you better make sure that nobody is going to die from the vaccine of those 22,000 people. If you have 1 person die from the vaccine, you've completely eliminated any benefit from the vaccine. And then you have all the other problems. Well, they have a table, it's called an S5. You have to read the table and then you have to read after the table, because the table they cheated a little on. But here's what it says. if you add up the deaths that are written underneath the table and what's in the table, there were, during the 6-month period, and remember, they unblinded in 2 months, so that, everybody essentially is vaccinated, but the placebo group has 4 months, 2 months less influence from the vaccine than the vaccine group. In the vaccine group, 21 people died of all causes. In the placebo group, only 17 died of all causes. So that means that if you take the vaccine, you are 23% more likely to die over the next 6 months from all causes than if you don't. Now, if Harvey Reich, who's this biostatistician from Yale, heard me say that, he said that's not true, because that study group that they're looking at is so small that you can't tell anything from it. It's only 44,000 people in it, and in order to make any kind of predictions, they should have had 440,000. And I said to Harvey Reich, yes, but this is the data that they used to get the permit, and therefore they're stuck with it. And what their own data show is if you take the vaccine, you're 23% more likely to die over 6 months than if you don't. Now, what were the people dying of? Well, it was easy, and all you have to do is look at table S5. There were, in the vaccine group, there were 5 deaths from cardiac arrest. In the placebo group, there was only 1. What that means is, if you take the vaccine, you're 500% more likely to die of a cardiac arrest than if you don't in the next 6 months. And it also means that for every life they save from COVID, they're killing 4 people from cardiac arrest. Now, if you look at Steve Kirsch's Substack today, he just broke down the data from England. It's showing for young people, the cardiac arrest, the myocarditis rate, is 100 times greater among vaccinated children than unvaccinated children. What we're seeing now in every country that did mass vaccination that has data, we're seeing excess deaths in 2022 that are 40% higher than 2021 during the pandemic. So, and only 50% of those excess deaths are to have positive PCRs for COVID. So something is killing huge numbers of people, and we're seeing this in all of these data points, in ambulance run data points, in insurance data points, from coroners, from all of these different sources, and in the mortality morbidity data from New York State, from Scotland, from Singapore, all over the world. We're seeing this huge spike in excess deaths, and when you drill down on it, it's mainly cardiac arrest. So we're also seeing other stuff. Here's what is probably most disturbing about the vaccine, is the antibody-dependent enhancement. And this is the phenomenon that has occurred with a number of vaccines, including the RSV vaccine that they used to give, and the dengue vaccine, and a bunch of others. And the people, it's also called paradoxical priming. And what it means is that if you get the vaccine, you're more likely to get sick and more likely to die when you get exposed. And here's what happened. And this is what happened with every coronavirus vaccine in the past. When they gave it to animals, the ferrets, which is the animal that's most analogous to human beings when it comes to pulmonary and lung illnesses, that the ferrets had this very admirable and robust antibody response. And you guys know when they test vaccines, they never go out and test them in the public and see if they work. They just do serological testing and they look whether you got an antibody response. if you get a robust and durable antibody response, you can get the vaccine license. They don't look at what happens afterwards. So what they saw in the ferrets was a very, very good antibody response. But then, when those ferrets were exposed to coronavirus, they died. The vaccinated ones died, and the unvaccinated ones did not. The same thing happened with the dengue vaccine. Bill Gates' vaccine, when they gave it to children in Singapore, the kids who got the vaccine died. And the same thing happened with the original RSV vaccine. And if you look at the interview that Mark Zuckerberg does with Anthony Fauci, he talks about that. And from the beginning, Anthony Fauci, Peter Hotez, Paul Offit were all saying, the one thing we're scared about is antibody-dependent enhancement, that the vaccine, after a time, because this would happen with every coronavirus, there was a huge effort to develop coronavirus vaccines after 2002, after the SARS outbreak, and there was a consortium of China and all the Western nations developed about 35 vaccines, and they all looked really good. The problem is they were causing antibody-dependent enhancement. So the people who took the vaccine got a very good antibody response, but then when they were subsequently exposed to the disease, they actually got sicker. And now what we're seeing in the real-world data is that the vaccine here's what it looks like it does. Immediately after you get the vaccine, there's a huge spike in death rates. And if you get my book, my most recent book, which is called A Letter to Liberals, there's about 30 graphs from 30 different countries in the front, and they show this huge spike. It's all Johns Hopkins data. As soon in the 2 weeks after you get the vaccine, there's a huge spike in infections and death. We don't see that in the vaccine data because they don't start counting you as vaccinated until 2 weeks after the second vaccine. So all the people who die in that first 6 weeks are counted as unvaccinated. But there's a huge spike there. Then the vaccine works for about 2 months. And the people who get vaccinated are less likely to get COVID and less likely to die of COVID. Then after 7 months, then there's a precipitous decline, a waning. And after the beginning of the 7th month, the waning goes into negative efficacy, meaning that if you got the vaccine, you are much more likely to get sick and much more likely to die than if you did not. And that's why they're trying to play this game with boosters now, but the boosters have diminishing returns. And, Lee, when she was up here, mentioned RSV. Well, RSV, first of all, do you guys know where RSV came from?
No.
RSV was unknown prior to 1955. Nobody ever had RSV. And it was called, and it came from a group of chimpanzees that were brought to Walter Reed Hospital to make polio vaccines with. Polio vaccines, viral vaccines, you cannot grow viruses without growing them on tissue. And for the human viruses like the polio virus, they grew them on monkey tissue. So during the 1950s, beginning around 1954, 53, they were making all the polio vaccines. They were importing 200,000 chimpanzees and monkeys a year into this country to masticate them, kill them, and grow vaccines mainly on their kidneys. And they didn't know it, but those monkeys were loaded with simian viruses. And the simian viruses had reached an equilibrium in the monkeys. In other words, as you know, through the course of evolution, the virus and the animal, the host, evolved so that it becomes benign. But when that virus jumps species, it will kill the new host. And so they brought, it was called chimpanzee cortisol virus at that time, and they had one troop that every one of them had it. And they said, that's curious, they're all sneezing and coughing. Let's go expose one of these to another troop that is uninfected and see if it jumps. And they did that, and it jumped. And then they said, let's see if it jumps to humans. And they took a kid who worked in the lab. I assume that he volunteered, but they never say that in the study. That he knew what they were doing, or they just said, go feed the chimps. And anyway, this kid got it. And so then he infected he was living in a barracks, and he infected everybody in the barracks. And then it spread across the country, and now it's the #1 killer of children in the world after malaria. It gave the polio vaccine. There's another virus that was in the polio vaccine called the SV40, simian virus 40. And Bernice Eddy was the most famous woman scientist in the history of NIH. This virus is extremely carcinogenic. It's so carcinogenic that today, laboratories all over the world use this virus to induce tumors in rats. So you give it to a rat and it will sprout tumors like mushrooms. She found it in the polio vaccine. And they were about to do a vaccine campaign and give 98 million children that vaccine, including me. And she went to the head of NIH. He told her, keep your mouth shut. She went and tried to give a press conference. They took away her phone. They changed the lock on her laboratory, and they silenced her. And they went ahead and they gave it to the whole baby boom generation, knowing there was this virus in it. And despite having spent hundreds of billions of dollars on the war against cancer, in our generation, soft tissue cancers, which the cancer SV40 causes, has gone up 10 times since the 1950s. So the breast cancers, the colon cancers, the bladder cancers, which are all cancer, and when you look at those tumors, they're loaded with SV40. So people talk about how great the polio vaccine is, but the cancers, soft tissue cancers that are associated with SV40 are killing orders of magnitudes of people more than polio ever did. And if you add RSV, which came from, ultimately from it wasn't in the vaccine, but it came from the process of making the vaccine, that kills a lot of people too. So now, RSV, we are seeing an epidemic of RSV among adults, among older people, and among children. And it's happened since the vaccine program. Now, when the vaccine program started, in January of 2020, I wrote a letter to Sanjay Gupta because I saw a documentary that CNN put on about how great the flu vaccine was. It was just a bunch of lies. So I went through all of the science and synthesized it, and went through every point. Does it actually save lives in elderly people? Does it prevent the flu? And I went through all of the studies. And the letter you can look at is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. letter to Sanjay Gupta. Look it up on Google. If anybody you know is ever going to take the flu shot, give them that letter. It's very, very convincing. Nobody who reads it will ever take a flu shot again. And one of the things it says is, I think there's 6 studies on whether the flu shot prevents you from getting the flu. Here's what it says. All these studies say the flu shot is effective against the strain of flu for which it targets. But if you get it, you're more likely to get other strains of flu than people who are unvaccinated, and you're much more likely to get a non-flu respiratory infection. And a lot of people believe the reason that we're getting RSV now is because of the immune suppression from the COVID vaccine, which works the same way as the flu vaccine. It suppresses interferon, it suppresses T cells, it suppresses our entire immune system. Right. So these children and adults who got this vaccine or whose mothers got the vaccine are now much more susceptible to this is what the science says, to non-flu respiratory infections. RSV, children used to get colds prior to 1955, but they were in their upper respiratory tract. And RSV is in the lower respiratory tract, and it can be more dangerous. So anyway, where was I? I got sidetracked on that. So we have a vaccine that they channeled us into one vaccine that is the only solution for this disease, for COVID-19. And what did they do in order to channel us there? They had to get rid of early treatments. Now, why is that? There's never been a time in history that you would go to the hospital sick from a respiratory infection, and the doctor would say, don't take anything, go home, lock yourself into your house with your family, and then come back when your lips turn blue and you can't breathe, and we're going to give you two things that are guaranteed to kill you, an intubation or remdesivir. That was their plan. So, if you will go to the hospital with a flu, they give you something, they'll give you even aspirin or something. So, but they couldn't give them anything. Why couldn't they give them anything? Because there's a little known federal law that says if there is a repurposed medication, any medication that's approved for any purpose, and it proves to be effective against the target disease, it is illegal to issue an emergency use authorization for a vaccine for that disease. So if they had admitted, they knew that hydroxychloroquine worked from 2008. Why? Because when they had the SARS virus, they were spending billions of dollars trying to figure out therapeutic treatments for SARS. And here's what they did. They were taking all kinds of repurposed medicine. They had SARS in 1 million petri dishes down at NIH and academic institutions all over the country. And they were taking drops of different repurposed medications, antivirals, obviously, dropping them in the petri dish and then seeing if they killed the virus. When they dropped hydroxychloroquine onto coronaviruses, everything died. Not only that, if they put it in there, they couldn't, before they put the virus in, no virus would grow. So NIH published a study saying not only is it a cure for coronavirus, but it is a prophylactic. You can't get it. So they knew, and as soon as coronavirus started circulating, in mid-January, all over Europe, where hydroxychloroquine was available over the counter, suddenly they changed the laws saying you can't get it anymore. It's a Class A drug, you can't get it without a prescription. They took all these steps to make sure people could not get this drug, because if they admitted that it might work, they could never go forward with this $100 billion vaccine enterprise. So they had to kill it. And, Anthony Fauci is a hero in this country to half the country. And I say, explain yourself. We have the highest death rate in the world. We have the highest body count. We, in this country, we did his protocols, particularly with remdesivir. For the first year, we're the only country that had remdesivir. So, and remdesivir, where did he get remdesivir? He got Ralph Barrick, who's this guy, who taught the Chinese how to make coronavirus, owns 1/3 of remdesivir. Gilead owns the other 2/3. And Gilead, with Tony Fauci's blessing, Tony Fauci had put that remdesivir in a trial for Ebola in Africa in 2019. And with 4 other drugs. And the Safety Monitoring Board stepped in and withdrew it. Now, Ebola kills 50% of the people who get it. Remdesivir was killing more people than Ebola. It was killing 54% of the people who got it, whether they had Ebola or not. And it kills you the same way that COVID kills you. You're with kidney collapse and your lungs filling with liquid. At least that's how we think COVID kills you. Because everybody in New York who was dying was getting remdesivir in the hospital, and we don't know whether it was the remdesivir that was killing them or the COVID. What we do know for a fact is that remdesivir is utterly ineffective against COVID-19, utterly. And the WHO has done massive studies that found that, and we also know that it kills you. It was too dangerous in 2019 to use to treat Ebola. And they started giving it to people with COVID-19 with an infection fatality rate of less than 1%, when Ebola has a 50% infection fatality rate, right? It was murder. But because Fauci went and announced it at the Trump press conference, and Trump said, and he said it works like a charm, he just lied. And he got Trump to buy all of the supplies of remdesivir for the first year. So we were all Americans and nobody else were getting it. Well, guess what? We have 4.2% of the population of the world, and we had 16% of the COVID deaths. How is that a success story? We had, in our country, the death rate was 3,000 Americans were dying of COVID for every million population. Let's compare that to a country that got no vaccination, 1%, 1.3% vaccination, Nigeria. And Nigeria, the entire population is on hydroxychloroquine because Nigeria has the highest malaria burden in the world. Half the population is on ivermectin because they also have the highest river blindness burden in the world. So Nigeria had a death rate of 14 people per million population. That's less than 1/200th of our death rate. Now, Nigeria has a much younger population than we do, and they don't have a lot of obese people. So there's other covariables. But if you look at a country like Japan, which has the oldest population in the world, they had a death rate less than 1/10 of ours because they allowed people to get them. And there are many examples of states in India and Asia that are adjacent to each other, where one of them would adopt, for example, Kerala in India, which adopted Tony Fauci's protocols, and the people died about the same rate they did in America and Europe. And then Uttar Pradesh, which did the opposite, that gave everybody ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, and they abolished the pandemic overnight. In Africa, most of the people get malaria, get hydroxychloroquine, and the average death rate was about under 300 people per million population, so less than 1/10 of what we had in this country. If you look at, and by the way, Nigeria had a 1.3% vaccination rate. Haiti had about a 1% vaccination rate. You're right next door to Cuba. Both countries have 11 million population. Haiti had a death rate of 850 people died from COVID. Cuba, which has 87% vaccinated, had a death rate of 8,500, so 10 times what the neighboring country. And if you go country by country around the world, the nations with the highest death rates were the vaccinated nation. The other thing that killed people was the lockdowns. And everything they did was the inverse of what you would want to do if you actually wanted to stop a pandemic. We know that this is a disease that spreads indoors. We know it's a disease that spreads among people with low vitamin D. You get the vitamin D from the sunlight. They were giving tickets to surfers in Malibu, $1,000, because they were out surfing. Like that's going to spread COVID. And they sent them to their homes, And every time they send one of these people, they goes your mother goes to the hospital and they say, "Oh, come back, you got COVID. You got it. Go home and wait there until you're about to die, and then we'll come back and we'll actually kill you." And every one of those events where those people were sent home were super spreader events.
Oops, so sorry.
We know this is a disease that spreads indoors, it doesn't spread outdoors. They went down near where I live to Venice. My kids go skateboarding, and they put sand on the half pipes. And they took the volleyball nets down on the beach, and they went to all the poor neighborhoods, and they either locked the basketball courts and playgrounds, or if they couldn't do that, they took the rims off the basketball baskets. So they're telling people, go lock yourself inside. And by the way, what are they doing? They're eating Twinkies and playing video games. And we gained an average of 22 pounds. That's not a good prescription for the... Tony Fauci never got up there and said, "Hey everybody, let's start taking care of our immune systems. Let's start taking vitamin D, because 98% of the people who are hospitalized are vitamin D deficient." There was no effort to do any of that. What did we get? We got a militarized and monetized response to this, to a public health crisis that had nothing to do with public health. And they took away our constitutional rights. They used it, they got rid of free speech in this country, astonishing. And Adams, Madison, and Hamilton said, we put freedom of expression in the First Amendment because every other right depends on it. If a government can silence its critics, it has license for every atrocity. And they went, and after, of course, freedom of religion, also in the First Amendment, they closed every church in our country for a year without offering a single scientific citation, without any public hearing, without any notice and comment, without any debate. They went after freedom of assembly. They're telling us you can't go near other people, they're all biohazards. And you got to lock yourself in your home. They went after jury trials. The Seventh Amendment says, it's very simple. It says no American shall be deprived of a right to a trial before a jury of his peers in cases or controversies exceeding $25 in value. There is no pandemic exception. There's just that, and by the way, if you read the history of the early part of our country, there were two epidemics during the Revolutionary War. There was a smallpox epidemic. The reason that Canada is not part of the United States is because we had a smallpox epidemic that in the middle of the Canadian campaign disabled the armies of New England. The armies of Virginia were sidelined by a terrible malaria epidemic. During the first 10 years before the Constitution was written and the Bill of Rights were adopted, there were yellow fever epidemics in the cities, there was cholera epidemics, there were terrible epidemics every year. The founders knew all about epidemics. And they knew also that you don't do lockdowns. And they did not put in the Constitution an exception for epidemics. So, and yet, here's what happened. We got rid of jury trials. For anybody who says they're giving you a countermeasure, no matter how negligent they are, no matter how reckless they behave, no matter how toxic the crap that they're giving you is, no matter how shoddy their testing, their quality control, quality assurance, no matter how grievous your injury, you cannot sue them. They just got rid of the Seventh Amendment of the Constitution. They got rid of the prohibitions in the Fourth Amendment against warrantless searches and seizures, and the Fifth Amendment, self-incrimination. You have to give your medical records before you go into a government building or a sporting event. You have to tell personal information about yourself. They're doing all this track and tracing surveillance. We now know that they were looking at our telephones to make sure that we obeyed, to see which communities were compliant. And you know, the worrying thing about this is that there's no end to it. Right here, what they try to do in this county to have an emergency use authorization, what does that do? If every time somebody gets sick, they can say, oh, it's another emergency. We have an emergency. We're still in a COVID emergency. There's no doctor in this country who will tell you, oh, there's an emergency in the hospitals right now. We're overloaded. We can't do anything. Oh, we're still under emergency. Why? Because it opens the doors of the Treasury so that they can ruin us and impoverish. This thing costs us $16 trillion. And we're all paying that through inflation. Inflation is how they tax the middle class and the poor. That's how they do it. They print the money and then they tax us that way. And it was a theft from the middle class. They closed down. Talk about the Fifth Amendment right to due process. They shut 3.3 million businesses in this country with no due process, no just compensation. And what did they do? They shifted all of that money from those businesses to a handful of billionaires, most of them from Silicon Valley. They're the same people, Microsoft and Bing, Facebook, Google, the people who were making tens, in some cases hundreds of billions from the lockdowns and were censoring people like me who criticized the lockdowns. So the government is shutting all of their competitors, funneling all the money to Amazon and Zuckerberg and Xbox, which Gates owns and everything else. And those people are making hundreds of billions, while Gates and Zuckerberg and Sergey Brin and Bezos are censoring people and silencing and deplatforming people who start asking questions about, is this good policy? And if you read my book, you guys all know about Event 201. And Event 201 was a peculiar because they did this in October of 2019. And it was a pandemic simulation where they simulated coronavirus pandemic. Coronavirus has never caused any pandemic. Nobody has ever even thought about it as a pandemic bug. Flu kills people, avian flu, swine flu. Coronavirus doesn't kill people. It never has been the issue before. Why the heck were they modeling a coronavirus pandemic in October of 2019 that kills 65 million people? And who's there? Gates, George Gale from the Chinese CDC, the World Economic Forum, which is a billionaire's boy club, which designed all of the lockdowns and stuff, which make all of their members richer. And then Avril Haines, who is the deputy director of the CIA. Why is the CIA interested in public health? The CIA doesn't do public health. They do coup d'etats against democracy. They have the CIA. Between 1947 and 1997, the CIA tried to overthrow or succeeded in overthrowing 1/3 of the nation, of the governments on Earth. 90% of them were democracies. Now, when I wrote my book, I looked at Event 201, and then I started deep diving, and I found that, 4 months before that, they had another one that did the same thing, but to the day, they were describing exactly what happened to us, the Mars. And then I went back and found almost every year they did one of these, and it wasn't just a few people. There were big shots at everyone. They had Sam Nunn at it, and they had the director of the president of Norway. They had Madeleine Albright do them, and they had Gary Hart and all of these famous people who would give the imprimatur of legitimacy. But every one of them, going back to Dark Winter in 2000, which was 3 months before the anthrax attacks on the US government, every one of them was modeling a pandemic that was going to be used as a pretense for clamping down totalitarian controls. And every one of them was written and designed, and there were participants from the CIA and InQtel at every single one of them. James Woolsey, the director of the CIA, was in the early ones. Every one of them. I name the names and show what happened and show the scripts. And they involved hundreds of thousands of people. They were doing it in secrecy. They were bringing in all the frontline workers, firefighters, hospital systems, public utilities, mayors, all of these people, and they were getting them to sign off. None of them talk about public health. None of them talk about how are we going to find repurposed drugs? How are we going to stockpile vitamin D for everybody? How are we going to make sure everybody gets exercise? How are we going to create a communications grid to all of the 15 million doctors around the world to find out what really works against this disease? In every one of them, they're modeling a corral to a chute, and at the end of the chute is an experimental vaccine. Every one of them. And they say, how do we get people to take it? We lock them down. We punish them. And they use all of these. I've been studying the CIA for most of my life. I wrote a book about my family's 60-year fist fight with the CIA called American Values. I grew up across the street from the CIA. I knew the day that my uncle was killed, my father brought John McCone. The first call he made was to John McCone and said, did our people do this? Was it the CIA who did this? My grandfather was on a commission that said, the Hoover Commission, that went after the CIA and said, we got to get rid of the clandestine services. You've got to separate them from the analysis and espionage sections because the whole country's being taken over by them. They are making a coup d'etat against American democracy. And so I've been studying for years, and I've spent $1,500 getting their manuals. And if you look at the old manuals from the 50s and 60s, from MK Ultra, from Operation Artichoke, there are all of these methodologies for how do you control individuals, exercise through propaganda, through torture techniques, through drugs, through psychedelic drugs, and through orchestrated fear, through destroying social systems and institutions, destroying trust among people, separating people from each other. And there's a number, and every one of those techniques was techniques that they use when they want to go to a developing country and impose control from above. And how do you shatter that society so that they will accept a centralized control, authoritarian control from these, from outsiders, a colonial model? And there's a couple of the experiments they did. They were funding experiments at 178 colleges and universities, including Yale and Harvard and many, many others. And one of the techniques they use is Stockholm Syndrome, where they lock people up and the people induce a fear that makes those people grateful to their captors and believing that the only way out of captivity is total obedience, and that anybody who criticizes the captors is their enemy, is endangering their lives, and must be treated, silenced, destroyed, burned like heretics. One of the techniques that they use, and I connect this for the first time to MK Ultra, is a technique that they developed at Yale, and where they brought people they recruited people from all walks of life. And they said, and they had students, blacks, whites, professors, business people from the New Haven area, and they bring them into a room, they sit them at a table, and they say, there's a guy in the next room who's tied to a chair to an electric system. We're gonna give them a shock. And the people, the subjects, the guy who was in the room who was screaming and struggling was actually a Confederate. He was an actor. And they would tell the person, a doctor would come with a stethoscope and a white jacket, and he would say, turn up the electricity. And the people would hear the person in the other room screaming and crying and begging and pleading, and they'd say, I don't want to do it. And the doctor would order them, do it anyway. And 67% of the people, and you can look this up on Wikipedia, 67% turned it to 250 volts that said potentially fatal. 33% walked out. But they didn't want to do it. None of them wanted to. But because they were ordered to by an authoritative figure who was dressed like a doctor, they did it anyway. And we're all part of that kind of big experiment. We have a doctor who's telling us, here's what you need to do. You need to violate your own values. You need to violate your sense of what's right and wrong. And you need to do what you're told. And 67% of the people are going to do that. The people who are in this room tonight are part of the 33%. And that's why I want to come here back here. I just, in closing, I want to tell you something that you already know, which is the battle that we're involved in is a spiritual battle. And we have to understand that, and the only way that we win this battle, if we maintain our own integrity and strength, and we approach every problem from a spiritual place. And people say to me all the time, they say, first of all, they say, isn't it hard on you that your family turned against you, you lost your friends, your income, and all this stuff? And I don't feel that way. I feel so lucky to be involved in a battle that's so important. I grew up in a family where I believed that my life would be consumed in some great controversy that pitted right against wrong, and it would be a great privilege for me to be able to take an effective part in it. Amen. And all of us, over the past 2 years, I'm sure everybody in this room has lost things that they valued and made sacrifices that took courage. And you can't look at that as a bad thing. We're being asked to do something, and it's to be part of a really great and important battle. And people ask me also, and we're all privileged to be part of this thing, because we know we're right on this. And we know that the whole world has gone crazy, that people are asleep. And we need to fight for them, for our neighbors and friends, till they wake up and are able to fight for themselves. People say to me, are we going to win this or what? And I never say yes, because I don't know. I don't know. I know history very well. And I can tell you, there is nothing like this that's ever happened before. And the reason for that, and Lee talked about the totalitarian, the fascists, and communists, and all this. And so the impulse is always the impulse for authoritarianism and totalitarianism, whether it's fascists on the right or communists on the left. It's always been there. But now they have an arsenal of weapons that have never existed. The ambition of every totalitarian regime is to control every aspect of human behavior, your thoughts, your actions, your movements, your spending, your conversations, your sexuality, everything that you do. They want every transaction to be monitored, your whereabouts to be known at all time. And of course, there's never been the power for any totalitarian regime to do that. You can always get away. You can always have secret conversations. You could sneak away somewhere. You could run away. Now you can't do that anymore. We're being watched everywhere. Bill Gates said there's now permits for 415,000, the US government, 415,000 low altitude satellites that are going to be, projecting Wi-Fi and watching us. Bill Gates has permits for 65,000, one of his companies, and he says his satellites alone will be able to look at every square foot of the planet 24 hours a day. So, they have that. They have facial recognition systems. We're all carrying GPS devices in our cars or on our wrists. They're trying to now impose digital currencies. Now they're doing that all over the world. And when they do a digital currency, those currencies are programmable. They will know every transaction that you have. And they'll be able to shut off your bank account like they did with the truckers in Canada. And there's no trial for those guys. There was no charges filed against them. They were seen they were in the wrong place. Their cell phone showed they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And the government shut their bank accounts. And, they'll be able to watch you through facial recognition. And and they've got a whole bunch of these viruses that are they're going to tell us polio virus and RSV and Coxsackie virus and dengue and chickamauga. And they got a pipeline forever. And every one of them, they have now a new emergency. So we're under a permanent state of emergency. They control the United States Treasury. They control the printing presses. And they control you. And they're going to tell you, okay, today's a mask day, everybody. Put on your mask. Then they see you without your mask on through a facial recognition. And your cell phone, they know it's you. Or you got too close to your girlfriend on a social distancing day. They're not going to put you to trial. They're going to say, okay, you are on probation lockdown. And your money will no longer work except at grocery stores within a half-mile radius of your home. Oh, if you try to go to San Francisco, drive there or something, your credit card can't buy gas. They will be able to exercise that control over all of us. This is what I call turnkey totalitarianism. When they get all of these systems in place, you saw during the COVID crisis, I was part of an early demonstration in Germany that had 1.3 million people at it. Nobody reported it. Nobody reported it. They were from countries all over Europe. Nobody reported it. In Australia, they had these huge demonstrations. Austria, all over. It never made the evening news. So they will be able to control the narrative. They'll be able to control your behavior. They'll be able to control your money supply. And no totalitarian system has ever had that power before. And we don't know what's going to happen when they have it. So I am not going to tell people we're going to win this because I don't know. I know there's a race now between they're racing to get those systems in place, and we're racing to grow our army. And we got to, we're building the army, and that's happening. We're educating people, and more people are understanding what we're up against. But I don't know that we're going to win. But to me, I was in the environmental movement for 40 years leading it. And I learned something in the environmental movement. You cannot get your heart broken by a loss. And when you're an environmentalist, every victory you have is temporary. Every loss that you have is permanent. You lose a species, they're gone forever. You may save a tract of land, but the next developer is in line trying to take it away and screw it up. So, I saw a lot of people who burned out. And the reason I didn't burn out is because I let go of the results. And I said, that's in God's hands. What happens, whether we win or lose, is in God's hands. The only thing I control is this little tiny piece of real estate inside my own shoes. And I know what I'm going to do every day. I'm going to wake up in the morning, I'm going to say, reporting for duty, sir. And I'm going to go to war, fighting this battle. And you have to be disciplined about not having expectations, because if you don't have expectations, you will never be disappointed. And if you're never disappointed, you cannot be crushed. And if you cannot be crushed, you are relentless. And all of us need to be relentless if we're going to win this battle. So thank you all very much.